When one looks at the progression of the war in Ukraine, a pattern of events becomes apparent. Events that shape the progression of the war more than any sum of a bunch of tactical victories on the battlefield. So to even try to glimpse at a potential end to this war, one has to assess possible future events that will have to happen first. This video will look at such past and current events and assess the likelihood of various future events to shape the war. Chronologically, the first event of war was the decision to invade in the first place. That Russian decision surprised Ukraine so much that in the initial weeks Russian forces managed to occupy a large chunk of Ukraine. All those early battlefield failures, culminating in the Russian withdrawal from the northeast of the country, pointed to an event that happened high up in the Russian military leadership prior to the war. So a movie-like flashback is in order. There must have been a moment where Putin and other Russian leaders said something like this: "This will essentially be a military coup operation. Ukraine will not put up a real fight, so we won't configure our forces for a real prolonged war, nor will we plan for that. We'll plan for maximum speed to perform the coup." Of course, that's just an idea of a sentence that might sum up Russian thinking before the war. Pretty much because of that event, and the bad Russian performance in general, NATO suddenly realized Ukraine is not doomed, and got bolder, because now the benefits outweigh the risks of angering Russia. That's the period in April and later when even heavier armaments started getting pledged to Ukraine, stuff like armored vehicles and artillery pieces. Another event was on the slow burner that whole time, and that's the mass mobilization of Ukraine. Ukraine was swelling up its troop numbers by a factor of 4 or so. All the while, Russian troop numbers struggled not to drop, as smaller-scale mobilizations were barely replacing the losses. Some half a year of training was needed before Ukrainian reservists became useful on the battlefield, to aid in September and October counteroffensives. Those offensives were thus a function of events happening earlier, the numerical superiority and informational superiority. Informational superiority came thanks to gradual increases in NATO's sharing of recon and surveillance data. Another event was the US decision to send its long-range guided artillery system to Ukraine, which happened around June. In the spring, the US was fearful such a decision would escalate the war, but by summer it was evident that particular weapon capability could bring a lot to Ukraine, and that Russia showed it's unable to meaningfully escalate the conflict further. One could say that those guided missiles, fired by HIMARS and MLRS systems, are the single most important weapon system Ukraine got that changed the war. Even the Javelins and Stingers were, per individual system level, somewhat less crucial. HIMARS managed to almost fully utilize the recon edge NATO and Ukraine had over Russia. Ukraine was able to actually pursue targets deeper behind Russian front lines, hit headquarters, communication nodes, ammo depots, crucial river crossings, and so on. Finally, as Ukrainians seemed to be getting an upper hand in some areas, Russia decided to react. To HIMARS, it reacted with a deal with Iran to get additional recon and strike capabilities through their drones. But such a deal took months to materialize. To the high numbers of Ukrainian troops, it reacted only when it became apparent those numbers were indeed working for Ukraine, meaning when Ukraine managed to pull off those counteroffensives in late summer. So then the event of Russia declaring partial mobilization happened, but that too is producing results gradually. In early December, Putin said some 77,000 mobilized troops are at the Ukrainian front lines, with another 73,000 being in Ukraine but not at the front line. It might take a month or two before all 318,000 mobilized troops reach Ukraine. The front line right now seems fairly set after the Russian withdrawal from Kherson. Crossing the very wide Dnieper River would be very hard for any army in the world when an opposing force is waiting for you. This stretch from the Dnieper near Vasylivka to the city of Donetsk is by far the most important part of the front in Ukraine, to both sides. If Ukraine manages to breach any part of that front, it might drive all the way to the Azov Sea and cut off all the regions to the west, which includes Crimea. The bridge to Crimea would then remain the only link for supply, and frankly it would be both inadequate for the volume of traffic needed, and it would become such a crucial target that it would likely get wrecked once again. If Ukraine is successful at reaching the Sea of Azov and holding those positions, it would basically be game over for Russia. Not necessarily right away within a week, but within months it would become obvious Russian positions west of that would be untenable. Such an event would likely send massive shockwaves through Russia as well, possibly causing a cascade of changes in internal politics, possibly even being the end of Putin's reign. Though, of course, there are no guarantees that Putin's successor would be any less pro-war. Front movements more to the east would not be as big game changers. For example, even if Russia loses cities of Donetsk or Horlivka, or even if Ukraine manages to push all the way to Alchevsk. Sure, those would be all huge hits to the Donbas republics, and they would definitely send ripples through Russia as well, influencing internal politics, but compared to losing Crimea, they might be manageable for Russia. Going further north, the stakes are even smaller for Russia. Losing Severodonetsk or Svatove, for example, is something that would not have a large direct influence on the end of the war. So which events would have such an effect? As we said, most of the frontline events, results of various offensives, are in some way or form dependent on earlier political events and decisions. For example, will the completion of the 300,000 reservist mobilization call change the calculus for Russia? No. It will help it stabilize the front, but Russia will still be unable to perform large-scale offensives. Will it mean Ukraine will be unable to progress further? That's harder to say, but it's less likely Ukraine will be able to progress at the places where it wants to progress the most, as those mobilized forces will help protect such areas. So can a further mobilization event happen? Well, for Ukraine, mobilizing further troops seemed to be increasingly harder. In early November, the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister said there were no plans for further mobilization. So some 900,000 personnel, when various organizations like the police and border guard are included, when fatalities are accounted for, seemed to be the limit for Ukraine for the time being. But in mid-December, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense official did mention further mobilization may become necessary and that the decision may come sometime after the New Year's. The way the statement was phrased, it may have been pointing to a small-scale mobilization round to make up for current losses. Russia is on track to meet that with roughly 500,000 troops once its mobilization run finishes. Now, of course, both countries could mobilize more, but A, mobilizing further people comes with its own economic downsides, and B, if there's not enough weapons for those people to use, then further mobilized troops get even more inefficient. While the exact number of people remaining in Ukraine is unknown, Ukraine seems to have invested roughly 3% of its current population into the military. That's not a trivial figure. It's not near the World War II figures of 20 or so percent, sure, but today those World War II figures are not attainable anyway. Today's economies are more complex, requiring a lot more and diversified workers, and in a more globalized world, refugees are more prolific than in the 1940s. On the other hand, Russia has so far invested some 0.4% of its population, including the troops mobilized in September. The morale difference is huge, of course, as Ukrainians are fighting for their country, and many Russian troops don't want to die in such a war. But in a worst-case scenario for Ukraine, given enough time, the morale difference may tend to get smaller, because Russian morale at an already low base may be dropping slower, while the Ukrainian troops, after a year of death and destruction, especially if there's no further big victories on the battlefield, may simply get psychologically more tired. Morale itself may have been a factor in all the Ukrainian counter-offensives around September. Had Ukraine not even tried to attack Russian positions, it might have suffered lower morale in the long term, because some Ukrainian troops might have perceived the situation as hopeless. But having routed the Russians at places, overall morale soared, even if temporarily, and even at the cost of local hits to morale in units where many troops died. So a vast morale superiority is something that's not a given for Ukraine in the long term. Russian strikes on infrastructure, especially the electrical network, are something that might in the long run also impact not just the back end of the Ukrainian military, but also the morale of its entire population. Not by much, but it may aggregate over time. In a worst-case scenario for Russia, if winter supplies are inadequate, Russian troops may simply start deserting en masse. Actual morale is hard to predict and may be in fact in between of those two worst-case scenarios. shorter frontline may also work in the defender's favor. There is a specific number of troops that work best per given stretch of a frontline. Adding more troops simply doesn't have a linear effect to adding more attack potential, so having a 2 million army may not actually be much more effective for the effort than a million-man army one, given the fairly short front remaining. US and EU support for Ukraine is a wild card. Literally, if that somehow stops, Ukraine would eventually be doomed. Ukraine's economy is very much wounded, and its GDP might drop by 35% next year. That means fewer taxes and a bigger hole in the federal budget. The US, the EU and other countries have been giving money to Ukraine to help with that, but it seems help will be needed throughout 2023 as well. Ukraine has a projected budgetary hole of some $38 billion for the next year. The EU plans to cover some $18 billion in theory, but even the 2022 money that has been committed has in actuality dripped quite slowly into Ukraine, with the EU paying just a quarter of what it had promised by early October, and with the US paying roughly a third of what it promised. Incoming economic woes for all the countries involved are hard to estimate, so it's really impossible to say just how much money will in reality flow into Ukraine during 2023. When it comes to very tangible military aid, such as individual weapons being sent to Ukraine, one can notice the pace has slowed down a bit, according to Oryx's list of military aid to Ukraine. Dozens of AMX-10 Bradley and Marder vehicles have been announced, but their combined quantities and delivery schedule appear to amount to 200 per month from February or March onward, not really bucking the trend. If the political or economic events in the West cause the West to start cutting down their aid to Ukraine, Ukraine might simply find itself in a situation where it's lacking military hardware and ammo for offensive ops or salaries to run the country, supporting the military. For example, Ukraine seems to be once again getting a bit low on potent armored combat vehicles. Tanks in particular, which are important for offensive operations, are not trickling into Ukraine at the pace they once were. It remains to be seen if the West will start sending NATO standard tanks, even if just the previous generation ones. In a way, it's surprising it hasn't done that already. NATO's weapons to Ukraine seem to be sent in a reactionary manner. For example, the uptick in SAM systems happened only after it became evident Iranian-sourced drones are becoming a threat. While NATO could in theory send a dozen high-end SAM batteries and make it much harder for Russia to wage terror over Ukraine, it remains to be seen if such a move will actually happen. For now, the West is sending those SAM systems in a trickle. As long as Russia doesn't escalate the air war further, which it doesn't seem to be capable of physically, it's plausible NATO will not supply Ukraine with masses of really potent SAM systems, which would really make a big impact on the battlefield. Equally so, if NATO had been sending 3 times as many tanks, artillery and other systems to Ukraine compared to what it's sending, then Ukraine would be in an even better position now. Who's to say what will really happen within 6 or 12 months? Events and decisions in the West can very much shape the war, just as events and political decisions in Moscow can. Current projections seem to point to an economic drop for Russia in 2022, one that's certainly larger than a crisis so far, but at the same time, Russia has seen even worse crises before, so it's inconclusive just how much of a political impact sanctions will have on the Russian will to continue to wage war. Further economic numbers for 2023 are likely needed to make that projection. But certainly such events impacting Russian leadership and their future decisions will also shape the war from the other side. If the order comes to keep fighting in Ukraine, it's likely the Russian military will still be able to do so. It's been badly mauled so far, yes, and future large-scale offensives are not looking likely at the moment, but merely keeping what territory they have right now, well, that's more doable, and will likely be even more doable during the winter, when offensives are harder to do, and maybe even more doable for Russia come spring, when all the reservists will have actual frontline experience. Especially by March, Russia might be in a position where Ukraine will drop from a 3-1 advantage in manpower to a 2-1 advantage. So in the long run, we might be talking even about not just late 2023, but even 2024 the events happening far away from the front line may shape the events on the front line, and slowly, gradually end the war in Ukraine. But when we say end it, we really mean produce a ceasefire, one that might last for years, various small-scale skirmishes notwithstanding, but one that will still see animosity simmer. In a way, it may not be that much different from the ceasefire in late 2014, which evidently lasted for 7 years. Now, all that is just one of the possible outcomes. Binkov finds it fairly likely that the war will not be resolved, that it will enter a pause, and that years in the future we may again see another, perhaps even bloodier war. Now, it's plausible Russia might in the meantime retreat from some more of its positions in Ukraine, but possibly not to an extent that would collapse the Russian war effort. The exception will be if Ukraine takes back that crucial territory towards the Sea of Azov, cutting off Crimea. Chances for that are hard to assess. If the leadership in Moscow decides to lower the support for the war, perhaps pressured by internal politics, then anything is possible. But it's also possible that if there are no new big successes for Ukraine, that the West will gradually lower its support for Ukraine to such an extent that Ukraine is simply unable to perform militarily. That option seems least likely of them all, because all the Western help so far might be in vain then. So the help from the West might slow down, but it's not likely it would completely stop. And it would not likely even be cut in half before a stable ceasefire is in effect. The war will be hard to end, and conflicts always beget future conflicts, as we know from world history. This current conflict might end only if all the sides get tired, or if one side invests much more in it than the other, withstanding great casualties to achieve a true victory within months. But the resources for that may not be politically available. And that's it. Thanks for sticking with us till the end of the video. This one was a bit more political than we usually make them. We won't be making too many of these. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tick that notification bell too. We've been toying with new thumbnail designs, as well as trying to publish videos even more frequently. Anyway, see you next week when we'll start our series of videos on some of the vehicles Ukraine will be getting.